gatherings on International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Here's hoping for a world that uplifts Indigenous voices, safeguards their rights. And today we're bringing to you a cross-border dialogue on the Himalayas, a very important and pertinent theme as we witness unprecedented industrialization, urbanization, propelled by contemporary capitalism, which has had adverse effect on mountainous regions, including the Himalayas, and people residing there, and raising critical themes for academic inquiry. Well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this dialogue, Dr. Rahul Ranjan. Most of you would be familiar with him, but a little bit about him. He's a writer and an assistant professor in environmental and climate justice at the Department of Geography, School of Geosciences, University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Over the decade, he has ethnographically worked on the long-standing conflict between social movements, Indigenous people struggles, and extraction politics in India. This research culminated in his book, The Political Life of Memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India, published by the Cambridge University Press in 2023. He's more generally interested in grief, environmental movements, climate change, and politics of knowledge. He has an upcoming volume, which he edits, titled Crisis at the Margin. It'll be published by the Routledge Press, London in 2024. And our speakers for today are Manshi Asher, who's co-founder of Himadra Environment Research and Action Collective, Renan Shah, who's India Fellow, the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, Harvard University, and Rohini Rai, who's lecturer of Sociology, Department of Social and Political Sciences, Brunel University, London. So I would now request Rahul to, very quickly introduce our presenters and, moderate the session. So welcome to all of you and to our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dipali. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session. Before I introduce the speaker, I must say that it's such a great effort that Doing Sociology kind of regularly takes on in kind of curating these sessions across thematic concerns in India, including Himalayan region, which for many reasons has been the center of discussion in the past few years. So I really am very thankful for Doing Sociology for creating this archive, more generally for student academics, but also as a form of a public-facing scholarship, and also accessible to a lot of audience outside academia. So thank you so much. Doing Sociology, we have three great speakers who are in the lineup today, and I will go on introducing each speaker at the beginning of their presentation. So the first presentation we have today is by Manshi Asher. Manshi has been associated with diverse organizations as a facilitator, campaigner, researcher, and writer since 1998. A large part of her work has been about environmental justice issues, with a key focus on forest, land, and water rights. In 2009, she co-founded Himdhara Collective to extend support and solidarity to mountain communities struggling to protect their landscape and livelihood. She found her home in Kanwari village in the lap of Dhauladhar, where she has been living for last decade and a half. Manshi is very modest, but her writings have variously surfaced and featured in different forms, from National Daily editorial to her recent, which I thought was a smashing piece on Run of the River project at the National Law School of Bangalore. And I've also had the fortune of knowing her for close to half a decade. We'd have Manshi present for about 10 to 15 minutes. Just a housekeeping rule as speakers go on presenting. Some of you who are not do not want to speak and would like your question to be sent out, do put your questions into the chat box and I can have them read in the order of the question. Or at the end of the talk, when speakers have finished speaking, you could use the emojis to raise your hand and I'll have you unmuted. You can ask your question yourself. But please join me in welcoming Manshi. Over to you, Manshi.
Thank you so much, Rahul. And I'm trying to just share the presentation. I mean, share the screen. Once I have that in order, I can start. Can you, is it visible?
Yes. Yes.
Mm, yeah, okay. So, thank you so much, Rahul. You're very generous with your words, always. And I don't know if I deserve that much. And thank you so much to Doing Sociology for having me here today. Though I have to say that I've been a student of sociology more outside than inside the classroom. But yeah, and my inspiration and motivation to engage with social issues came from my 11th and 12th sociology teacher. So she's not here with us today, but I wanted to say this at this platform. I was just rethinking about the framing of the subject today, and I realized that in the last 2.5 decades of working with social issues, of which almost 2 decades were spent in the Western Himalaya. Um, the words, Vikas and Paryavaran Sanrakshan, I think these have been the most uttered words as well as the most heard words in the, circles that I've been interacting in, or, in different kinds of formal and informal spaces. And between these two contested domains or ideas is the question of resources, which we refer to as Jal, Jangal, Jameen, but also Janwar and Jan. And with, and in yeah, and the politics part of it is really questions of power, identity, autonomy, justice, survival, which is what we are seeing unfolding right now in the region, in various kind of ways. I have to say that also in the initial years that I started working in the mountains, I did not relate or engage with the idea of the Himalaya. I think partly because I was too absorbed in, just coping with the experience of living in the mountains, and which I found mentally challenging, physically demanding, given my own caste, class, and urban privilege. And then further, there was this baggage of the role of a community, a young community facilitator and mobilizer with a social organization. So it was only later when I moved to Himachal that I started noticing the patterns and recognizing that every valley is a sort of a socio-cultural microcosm. And also, Rahul knows that, a program that we have been doing for the last 10 years almost, called Pahad or Hum, is a youth workshop that happens annually, started talking about structural issues in the Himalayan region. And it is here that I think a deeper engagement with the overwhelming diversity and complexity of the Western Himalaya as a region was foregrounded for me. And the dialogue amongst young participants who were from mostly from the Western Himalaya, but also from other parts of the Himalaya. Uh, you know, it threw up everything from life in a militarized zone like Kashmir, where the relationship with the nation state or the historiography of the socio-ecological relationships are contrasting or different from, let's say, Uttarakhand and Himachal, which have high rates of army recruitments with deep impact on identity. So um, and then there was also this, of course, the emerging challenge of the paradoxical, portrayals of this place called the Himalaya. So one moment, I mean, it's a strategic frontier always from the point of view of the state, and that is priority. But one moment it's a heavenly abode in Instagram reels, and the next moment its rivers are, raging and spelling doom, etc. So while refraining from the tropes, we are still compelled to examine the commonalities and the contiguities, especially the the lateral and the longitudinal contiguities here, the climatic and the topographical dynamics that are there, and the occupational traditions, be they of trade and agropastoralism, or the cultural adaptations around these, ecological niches that were being used in multiple ways by the indigenous people. And most importantly, the socio-cultural, the socio-political conflicts of the last century in this region, all of which are now evidently playing a role in what is happening today. I want to go back actually to this idea of development in Uttarakhand when I was there in the late 90s in this place called Munsiari. This is Johar Valley, Tibet Nepal border, and Vikas was or development was very much a part of the Pahadi identity assertion there. And this assertion was against the exploitation and loot by a corrupt sarkar, which was Maidani, or of the plains. And if you look at the clipping below, you see the children carrying a placard. It says Badi Madwa Khayenge, Uttarakhand Banayenge, which is basically, again, food, Madwa is the millet, and the food becomes a cultural symbol which is connected with the future, and the children represent that future. But at the same time, if you look at the news clipping that is there, there are three important elements in it, which talk about the struggle for statehood, and the sit-in that's happening in Garhwal. On top of that, it says Muslim Janta bhi Andolan mein utri. And then there is another, headline just below the pictures, which says Rudraprayag mein Arakshan Virodhi Chhatron ne Uttarakhand Kranti Sena banai. Both of these, talk about the ethnic and caste undercurrents and the Savarna domination of the Pahadiness that is being spoken of. I think it's important to engage with that. And yeah, one more thing that, of course, in places like Munsiari where I was, access, connectivity, employment, these remain the main, issues that that were being raised for, for a statehood or in favor of statehood. But there was this, and when statehood was achieved, I would say that Himachal ke model pe vikas karenge was the most common thing that one heard at that time. And in 2007, when I went when I started living in Himachal, some of the things that I want to speak about, the striking differences, which, struck me. I mean, like which kind of one realized over the first few years. One is that in a state where most land holdings are marginal, there was very little landlessness thanks to very successfully implemented land reforms, which remain unfinished, and I'll speak about that later. And also protective legislations that, kind of prevented sale and rampant sale and purchase of land. There was access to, and connectivity, bijli, pani, sadak, anything that you speak about in the arena of welfare and social welfare. Additionally, horticulture and cash cropping in many of the districts made sure that the youth were going out for higher studies, but they were coming back to work on the land. And then there were government jobs as well. I mean, I was just seeing the budget, this year's budget, and almost 80% of the budget is being spent on salaries, pension, and interest. Now, that puts Himachal in a very tough fiscal situation, but it also shows the fact that, the government jobs are an important part of the economy. And there were also gradual land use changes happening, sedentarization, modernization, that everything else that goes with this development, loss of food diversity, saw a powerful bureaucracy, the political elite, and a new middle class emerging, which was mostly the landed castes. But what was interesting in terms of the similarity between Uttarakhand and I want to mention this because there is the Devbhumi narrative, a common narrative between both, but yet invoked very differently in both places. So in Uttarakhand, it was more to do with the Char Dham and the used by the pilgrim tourist industry. And in Himachal, it was more referring to the local deities. And in the first 2 to 3 years that I spent in this state, we saw a series of cases where against a large tourism project, against a hydro project, against various kinds of interventions, developmental interventions that were happening at the village level, the devtas were, passing resolutions against it through the oracles. So, again, devta is somewhat, Devbhumi in Himachal refers to this daily engagement with the devta and the powerful role that they play at the village level. Which is even in the areas which are Buddhist or not or even Hindu. I don't want to get into the details of that, but what we see in the last decade and a half are converging contestations that are tied to neoliberal extractivism. So you have this push for vital, unquestionable infrastructures like hydropower, mega hydropower, tourism, very large scale, again, highways, railway projects, cement industry and pharmaceutical industry. Of course, Thekedari Pratha, the contractors at the village level being part of this, it's not just policy coming from top, but something that, the society is engaging with, the elites are engaging with, and causing ecological degradation and geological disturbances against which there are a lot of, we see resistance in different forms every day and more, bigger mobilizations. But the slow onset and, extreme climatic events have exacerbated, the impact on livelihoods and survival with, the cascading, compounding, and protracted disasters that we see today, a cycle of disasters that we are not being able to the region is not being able to come out of. And the resource conflicts and contestations, have also are at the local level, and you see unequal and individualized risks. You see reproduction of caste and gender hierarchies in this entire process. And coming to the conservation part of it, and here I want to talk about the colonial continuities or residues in material as well as discursive ways as far as conservation in the Himalaya goes. It's in the colonial period, you had a reservation of the forest with the 1927 Forest Act for the empire, putting in place of policies that commodified forests, pushed for monocultures on grasslands, monocultures of cheat pine, which today have become a major contributing factor to forest fires in the I would say that this time J&K, Himachal and Uttarakhand saw the largest number of forest fires. So, and this is the mid-Himalayan belt, which is also where all the cheat plantations are. And on the other hand, at least in the post-colonial period, there was a push for a forest policy that said that 2/3 of the forest cover of the area in the hill states needs to be under forest cover. And this needs to be maintained for national interest. And there was the theory of Himalayan degradation, which also demonized the use of the forest, the indigenous, lifestyles as the destroyers of forests. So there was this on one hand, a series of laws and judicial diktats that restricted use of the local and indigenous communities and shrunk the livelihood base or the accessibility, or led to forest alienation. And on the other hand, there's been fragmentation of forests and degradation of forests by the larger infrastructures. And the most recent amendments again are going to impact the Himalayan region the most, which are the Forest Conservation Act amendments, or the One Panchayat rules, which are being centralized, are centralizing power with the Forest Department. And it's not just, the capital, the forest as capital for ease of doing business, but also for plantations, for climate solutions, for carbon forestry projects, for REDD+ projects, for restoration projects. Landscape level restoration is one of the big elements of the climate solutions that is now coming into this region. And the governments now of the Himalayan states are demanding a green bonus, because what they're saying is that we have to forego revenues because we have to preserve this forest. So there's a burden of preserving the forest. But of course, the green bonus will be used to pay off the salaries. So it's now become a vicious circle. And I'll just, I don't know how much time there is left. You could perhaps, have I crossed my limit? Okay, I'll just finish here. Basically trying to say that, with the apocalyptic framing of disasters and increasing, a push towards, climate mitigation and adaptation measures, this region is being looked at through a single lens of this climate crisis. There's an issue there because the nature of the conflicts are long-standing, they are multi-layered, they are historical, and they are political in nature. And the crisis is getting more and more I would say complex, as well as the convergences are more evident now in this region. And it would, kind of require more interdisciplinary work and more dialogue to really understand what could be the pathways forward. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manshi. I'm very sorry if you had to cut yourself short, but this was such a comprehensive presentation. I'm sure everyone will have lots of questions. Just to remind you, put your question into the chat box just in case if you do not want to ask your question yourself. I can have them read in the order it's been asked. And other ways that I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and I'll have you unmuted. You can ask your question yourself. Great. After this brilliant presentation, we have Rinan Shah. Just to introduce, Dr. Rinan Shah is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Lakshmi Mittal Family Asia Institute, South Asia Institute at University of Harvard, at their Delhi office. Her work more broadly engages with the question of thinking and rethinking water governance in the mountainous landscapes, which are marginalized politically, socially, environmentally, and economically in a rapidly urbanizing world with uncertain and intense ecological calamities. Her research draws from a rights-based approach to natural resources on the principle of equality and capability to pay or participate. Her current postdoctoral research project seeks to understand territorialities of governance, of boundaries of spaces and their definitions, law and everyday practices, and the creation of inequality using gendered framework. Dr. Shah was awarded her PhD in 2023 from Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, Bengaluru. Her thesis attempted to disentangle the drivers of domestic water scarcity in volumetrically water-rich Eastern Himalayan region, where communities have been facing water scarcity for decades. Welcome, Rinan. You have about 10 to 15 minutes to do your presentation and just ask if anything, and we're very happy to have you.
Yeah, hi. Please tell me when my time is almost up because I won't be able to see you. So just unmute and tell me. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you all see?
Yeah, I can see, but I can only see a dark screen at the moment. Yeah, I can see now. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope this will be a nice beginning to your lovely weekend. So, for my work here, as Rahul just mentioned, I have been trying to look at water governance from different aspects that exists out there. And for this particular work, which this current work that I'm presenting largely draws from my PhD work, where I went in to understand why are the mountain communities of the Eastern Himalayan region, which is one of the highest rainfall receiving regions in the country, face water scarcity. And out of the many threads that came out of this research, one of it was the interaction between the formal and informal. Water governance and institutions, when we talk about water governance and institutions, things have been changing a lot, where we talk about where water governance initially looked at, just the volumetric or how much water you were getting. So largely initially it was thought of as the volume, only the volume needs to be sufficient. With time, it moved on to include aspects of quality. And further, at this stage, water security and governance has expanded enough to include aspects of negotiations, aspects of institutions, and and the interactions that exist at these levels. When we are looking at questions of water scarcity, which has largely been seen as a very technical problem, right? They say, if the demand is not equal to the supply, then scarcity exists. So in a very straightforward fashion, it has been looked at. However, there are studies which look into the production of water scarcity as a whole, as to what are the different drivers that lead to the creation of water scarcity. And my focus is largely on the institutions, and what the institutions which are norms, rules, or practices that impact decision making, and as well as organizations which then are collective groups which work around or look at the management, distribution, and supply of water. I call the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, or the Himalayan region, marginalized due to its one aspect of it is also the geographical distance at which it is from the rest of the country. So in a way, it has this it has a little. It has impacts of it being distanced from, say, positions of power or decision-making centers. If we look at it, when we speak about environmentally marginalized, because the Himalaya are one of the youngest mountains in the world, and livelihoods, as we might have been, all of us have been seeing how disasters and calamities, which are which are a norm rather than an exception in the Himalaya. So by virtue of it being the Himalayan region itself, it has a lot of environmental repercussions on the state itself, on the region itself. In terms of the political representation, we can make out by the kind of policies, the nature of policies that are made, that rarely is a time where mountain states are included actively in policy making. Actively, we see a representation. And in terms of when I speak about the Eastern Himalaya, largely it also, and as well as other parts of the Himalaya, because my expertise is mostly on the Eastern Himalayan region, is also about aspects of economic sustenance, because most of the regions are dependent on large state aid. So in a sense, the interaction that allows you to have economic sustainability is also a little difficult. Largely my work is based on Darjeeling town. On your left, you can see the imagine. You can see the state, you can see the town, it has grown along the slope. And this imagery is something which I think which needs to be made more popular, because when we speak about towns, when we speak about urbanization, it is largely seen as expansion over a two-dimensional space. when we speak about urban towns, even if we probably move to the metropolitan cities, the imagination does not easily capture how an urban mountain town looks like. And with that, then we also come into the question of how issues of spatiality, how issues of altitude becomes important in addition to the agency of nature when we are looking at access to resources in these regions. Darjeeling town is a colonial town, like most of the hill stations across the country, and it is a very it's a compact. It is one of the densest urban settlements in the entire Hindu Kush Himalayan region. According to the census, it was that was way back in 2011. It said the population was 120,000, but that's just the fixed population. We have a lot of migrating population, so on and so forth. Yeah. To carry out this work, I have been engaged with this work since 2014, which was my master's thesis, where that was the first instance of me engaging with this puzzle or paradox, as is commonly said, that the region faces a lot of water scarcity, but why is it experienced? So initially, when I looked at it, I was trying to simply look at how the availability is, how the accessibility is, and that drove me towards larger questions of climate analysis or rainfall analysis, looking at questions of institutions, as well as going deep down and also looking at household level work. So in this presentation, I'll be drawing from all these different kinds of field work that I carried out and presenting presenting one of the many arguments that I have. I think 2017 is an important year because it was the statehood agitation movement in West Bengal, in Darjeeling, which is a part of the state of West Bengal, and statehood agitation movements have been occurring at the interval of, you can say, 10 to 15 years, where a separate state is. Where the people from the region demand a separate state within the state of West Bengal, and the pandemic years, as we all know, was difficult to carry out a field work. 2017 and statehood agitation movements become important, as you see, when we look at the question of the institutions. When we speak about formal institutions, we talk about institutions which are associated with the state. It can be the state at the center, state at the provincial level, that's the state of West Bengal, or at the local level, which can be the urban local bodies such as the municipality. At the informal level, we have community-based organizations, many of which are registered in some ways, but they do not directly align with the state. So that's how I have made the segregation. Interestingly, you will see that we have two public health and engineering departments here. One is the State Public Health Engineering Department here, and the other is the Gorkha Territorial Administration Public Health Engineering Department. So this happened when when an autonomous hill council was provided to the territorial region of Darjeeling Kalimpong Hills, which led to the creation of the Gorkha Territorial Administration, creating splinters in existing departments of the government, such as the PHE. This is just one example because I'm talking about water. And PHE in the entire state of West Bengal is responsible for bulk supply of water, where you bring water from resources such as the rivers, streams, and then put it into a supply tank. And the supply is carried out by the urban local bodies, such as the Darjeeling municipality. Here itself, you can see how much of interaction and consideration needs to be had between the different departments to work together to make water, which is a basic resource, available to households. And here is where a lot of issues also come in. Informally, we have springs, which have largely been public sources or common sources, but which have slowly been transitioning into privatized sources for profit or even simply for consumption at the household level. The private water suppliers are the most interesting group of private water suppliers because they have been expanding rapidly, and also they have been taking over whole town. So in this case, in Darjeeling, we had 12 different kinds of private suppliers which looked at with supplied water. And then you have Samaj, which are very unique community-based organization in the Eastern Himalayan region, including Darjeeling, Sikkim, and Kalimpong, which are based on, say, ethnicity, which are based on religion, all, and most importantly, on geographical location, which means that if a spring is located adjacent to a spring, if a village is located adjacent to a spring, the village itself, becomes attached to the spring through a Samaj. So we have all these institutions and the interactions between them. When we see it here, it's a very, it's a neatly segregated approach. But when we are a household within the town trying to engage with all these different departments, all these different water suppliers from a household level, it makes the water accessibility a very dynamic process, which has implications on on the costs, and also on implications on the time, and also your mental health. Darjeeling has been very dynamic. As we mentioned, we have had within the municipality, when we look at the formal water supply, the picture hasn't been very rosy because there have been territorial council and uprising. In certain time around the 70s and 80s, there was no commissioner or ward councillor in the municipality, which might have had implications on the water supply units. The water supply, I forgot to mention before, was initially set up by the British in the early 1900s. 2 tanks we have in the Central Wildlife Sanctuary, from where water is supplied to the entire town of Darjeeling. However, the municipality covers only 7 to 10% of the entire town. The rest of the 85 to 90% people depend on springs and other private water supplies. So that's the picture. Municipality has undergone changes from being an independent body, as a lot of respondents spoke about how it used to be run by people who were quote unquote social workers, or people who had something who had a good engagement with the society, but it moved to one becoming where it became a department that was run by largely by the politics of the region. Due to differences in the political affiliations between the state and the local government, as recent as 2019, led to a direct dissolution of the Darjeeling municipality, which is an urban local body, directly depending upon funds from the state government. So, and the current scenario, the low formal water supplies, which is around 8 to 10%, can be said to be a legacy of the colonial history, and it's very slow growth post-independence, and the tussle between the regional government and the state government. So all of this makes municipality in a way, difficult. It makes it difficult for the municipality to work around it, but also we do not see spaces where municipality is trying to make it better. Because of the different kinds of institutions that are there, we see that there's a fragmentation which is political because of the political affiliation. Simply issues, because when we look at the PHE, it looks at certain kinds of issues. When we look at the forest department, it looks at different kinds of issues. So the interaction between them then becomes difficult. There have been gaps in design and implementation and other program and such things, where if the PHE has built a larger infrastructure, the municipality is unwilling to use it, stating, ineffective construction. So, and those kind of things are also exist. And clearly there is a mismatch between biophysical and political boundaries, which is not only the question at a very town Darjeeling level, but it also a question which is affecting the larger governance at the national level, where you have different departments looking at different water sources, or a department looking at water source only in a particular state, which makes it difficult to manage water, which is a multifaceted resource and a flowing resource. So those are the mismatches which are happening. In Darjeeling, we have multiple sources of funding and implementation, which makes smooth transitioning from one to the other difficult. We have state-affiliated organizations such as the Military, Forest, and Tea Board, whose interactions in a way eats up a large chunk of water supplied by the municipality. And also, yeah, that those kind of taking away of larger resources by the state affiliated departments also happens. And you have different infrastructural responsibilities and locations. I would like to conclude by looking at the informal info. Why do I call it informally formal or formally informal? Is that when we look at Darjeeling municipality and the different institutions and organizations that exist, informal institutions, in this case, the private water suppliers and the spring supplies, have emerged due to circumstantial constraints. Such as the inability of the municipality to scale up to match up the change in population, or simply to scale up to even have a sufficient amount of water. In Darjeeling, water has become is very expensive, which requires around, you need to have at least around 1.75 lakh rupees to even apply for a connection, with a waiting time of around 5 years, which has made water more of a luxury than a basic necessity. Informal institutions have also emerged due to ineffective political project implementation, and a lot of households have commented on the dependability of the informal sources, because they say that the only factor is money, and that is easier to acquire than getting a municipality connection, which has a lot of different kinds of legality aspects that you need to pass before being eligible. Yeah, as I mentioned in the second part about rigid bureaucratic processes, high costs, corruption, and red tapeism, sorry, within the municipality. Uh, so these are when the informal institutions interact. Even when the formal institution comes in, for example, when the municipality is building a public tap or building a shared tap, the Samaj, which is a community-based organization, not a formal organization, they do create rules of access over these municipality taps, which in a way breaks your private public dualism that exists in your larger, neater picture. And what we should also remember is that even public resources and common property resources, in this particular example, springs, which are considered the hallmark of common property resources in the mountains of the Hindu Kush Himalaya, become parts of hierarchies and power systems which are overridden with sociocultural and customary patronage. Customary patronage, in a way, has enabled creation of common property resources, but it also impacts how and who are thought to be eligible to access those springs. So in conclusion, I would just like to rewind and talk about, we looked at the formal and informal water provisioning systems, and how this, when neatly looked at from a very, Archimedean view, we see that it is very neat and clean. But when we go down and look at the interactions that happen, it leads to a lot of multiplicities, hybridities, having high impact at the household level as to how and where do they get their water from. I would like to conclude by saying that, all these difficulties in accessing state water supplies, which I feel the state has an accountability to do so, considering everybody they consider as citizens of the state, is something which is largely amiss in Darjeeling town. Might be similar scenarios in other parts of the Himalaya, and the marginalization of the region itself has led to the creation of water scarcity. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Renan. Thanks for such a robust presentation. It was very comprehensive. I have lots of questions. Before we move on to the next speaker, just letting everyone know, if you have any question that you do not want to ask yourself, please, this is your time to put your question into the chat box so that it could be read at the end of all presentation. We would have about 15 minutes after the presentation to ask Q&A, in addition to the question I may have for one or all presenter here. Thank you, Renan. Next and the last speaker we have today is Dr. Rohini Rai. Dr. Rohini Rai is a sociologist of race, ethnicity, migration, and racism, and currently holds a position as a lecturer in sociology of race at Brunel University in London. Her area of research include racialization and racism in the UK, and in relation to Northeast India and Eastern Himalayan borderlands. Her current project, which is funded by British Academy and partnered with the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geography, engages with UK-based Indigenous Himalayan diaspora community from Nepal and Northeast India, including Sikkim and Darjeeling. Prior to this, she was involved in an ESRC-funded project, Decolonization and Ethnic Inequalities in the UK Higher Education at the University of Manchester, where she also was awarded her PhD. Outside academia, she works with communities as the co-founder of the Critical Himalayan Collective, and she has a long list of publications that you might want to look at to know more about her work. Thank you so much, Rohini, for joining the discussion today, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Rahul, for the generous introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my PPT slides. I hope this is okay
Yeah,
for everyone.
I can. Yeah.
Right, so if you may, I'm going to start now. So yeah, so hi everyone. Thank you first of all to Doing Sociology for making me a part of this amazing sort of conversation. I'm really honored to share space with Renan and Manchi, so thank you very much. So my presentation today is slightly different from the previous two presentations, but I could see that there are a lot of sort of transdisciplinary conversation, which I'm hopeful to have after today's session, right? So basically, my presentation today is titled Dancing Indigeneity in the Eastern Himalaya, Sakela City as World Making, where I will be basically sort of exploring the politics of indigeneity in the Eastern Himalaya context, particularly of Nepal, Sikkim, and Darjeeling. But as you will see, this presentation focuses more on the Indian side of the border in Sikkim, Darjeeling, but in conversation with the Nepal side of the border. And here I will be basically looking into the politics of indigeneity through the lens of dance, particularly through the case of Sakela City dance. So overall, again, what I aim to do through this presentation is to examine how dance serves as a powerful tool in the assertion and in the assertion of and the politics of indigeneity in the Eastern Himalayan context. Right, so just as Rahul already mentioned in the intro, this presentation is a part, or this paper is a part of a broader project which involves dance and archives and community engagement. But this today's presentation focuses on the dance strand of the project, right? And also a disclaimer, this is just a work in progress at the moment, so I'm really sort of excited to hear constructive feedback and thoughts from you all. So on that note, I want to start by talking about what Sakela Sili is and the importance it holds in the politics of indigeneity in the region. So Sakela Sili is a dance specific to the Kiratrai community of to which I myself also belong, which is from the transborder Eastern Himalayan region, including present-day Nepal, Sikkim, Darjeeling, and Kalimpong, as well as Assam and other parts of Northeast India. And within the sort of wider context of global migration, the Rai diaspora also extends to places like the UK, US, Hong Kong, etc. And Sakela Sili dance sort of remains a vital cultural practice even within the context of the diaspora. Right, so that's what Sakela sort of Sili is. It's a dance form, and traditionally Sakela Sili has been performed during the Sakela or Sakewa, Uphauli and Udhauli festivals, which are festivals celebrated biannually by Kiratrai community, which kind of honors the nature and ancestral spirits and marks the cycles of sowing and harvesting, right? And Sakela Sili also typically is performed outdoors in a circular motion, and the dance step sort of mimics birds and animal movements, as well as sort of mimics agricultural and hunting practices, right? And it is all done with or within the sort of rhythmic beats of the Sakela Sili Kani or Sakela Sili drums. Right. So again, historically, Sakela Sili has largely been sort of performed in ritualistic settings in the villages of eastern Nepal. However, and this is what I'm interested in, is that there has been a resurgence of Sakela Sili across the borders into Darjeeling, Himalaya, Sikkim, and even beyond, right? And as well as this sort of trans-border movement of the dance form, Sakela Sili is also now practiced in other contemporary contexts, like in staged context during, certain celebrations, during weddings, as well as it has increasing digital footprint on social media platforms like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, etc. Right. So again, in this presentation, my key sort of argument is that this resurgence of Sakura City reflects not just a revival of past culture, which is the sort of dominant idea that is presented when we talk about Sakura City. Rather, I argue that it is an activation and expression of embodied knowledge that works to actively reimagine our past, present, and future. Or in other words, Sakura City can be seen as a world-making process. Right. So to begin with, then we need to contextualize the emergence of or the resurgence of Sakura City within the context of the politics of indigeneity in the Eastern Himalayas. Right. So again, many of us here who are familiar with the identity politics in the region, we all must have sort of noticed that in the past decade or so, there has been a rise in indigenous consciousness and politics in the Eastern Himalayan region of Nepal, as well as Sikkim, Darjeeling, and in Northeast India. Right. And here again, the communities have increasingly sort of articulated identity politics through the language of indigeneity. Right. And of course, sort of this is shaped by local and national sort of contextual factors, which I will be talking about in this slide. But it is also sort of informed by global discourses around indigeneity, for instance, the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous People and so on. Right. So again, coming back to the context, so the sort of politics of indigeneity has emerged across the border in Eastern Himalaya. And starting off with Nepal, right? So in Nepal's context, the Kirat Rais are legally recognized as one of the 59 indigenous communities under the National Foundation of Development for Indigenous Nationalities Act of 2002. And this is sort of rooted in the historical Janajati movement that emerged in Nepal since 1990s, which advocates for identity-based federalism and local autonomy, which is seen or exemplified in the ongoing demand for a Limbuwan state in eastern Nepal. And for Kirat Rais in Nepal, there was a similar sort of ethnic identity assertion around the creation of Hambuwan ethnic homeland of the Kirat Rai community, right? So again, in the context of Nepal for Rais or for the Kirat Rais, the articulation of indigeneity is a result of marginalization from the broader Brahmanical Hindu Nepalese state. And this has been mobilized through various cultural organizations like the Kirat Rai Yayoka established in 1990. Right, so that is on the Nepal side of the border. Now, moving on to the Indian side of the border, starting off with Sikkim, right? So this Janajati movement in Nepal has had significant influence, I would say, in the Sikkim and Darjeeling Himalaya. That is given the porous nature of the geopolitical borders. However, indigeneity in the latter, on the Indian side of the border, is also distinct in the sense that it is also shaped by the overarching framework of the Indian nation state, right? So in the context of Sikkim, right, while the Rais are subsumed within the broader Sikkimese Nepali ethnic category, the Kirat Rai identity began to assert itself even before the merger of Sikkim with India in 1975. So again, since 1960s, there was already an assertion of Kirat Rai distinct cultural identity, but this became later propelled again in the 1990s, for instance, through the creation of cultural organizations like Akhil Kirat Rai Sangh in 1990 and so on. And what is distinct on the Indian side of the border in Sikkim is that indigeneity or the politics of indigeneity is mainly framed in regards to the Indian reservation system and the demand for recognition as a scheduled tribe within that framework, right? So again, that is in the context of Sikkim. And similarly, in the context of Darjeeling as well, again, the sort of politics of indigeneity is shaped by its distinct sort of historicity and political context. So in the context of Darjeeling, political assertions, as we know, as Renan mentioned already, right, it has since the 1950s, and again, mainly in the 80s up to 90s, and even now, it has focused on the demand for a separate Gorkhaland federal state within the Indian Union for the Nepali-speaking Gorkha or Indian Nepali population, right? However, in the recent years, there has also been this oscillation towards a specific community-based identity politics, which is seen in the wider demand for recognition of scheduled tribe status by various Nepali-speaking communities, as in the case of Sikkim. And within that context, again, the Kirat Rais of Darjeeling have also been sort of articulating their politics through an aspiration of attaining Kirat-Rai tribal identity. And this has also been sort of propelled through cultural organizations like the Kirat Khambu Rai Sanskritik Sangstan in Darjeeling, which was established in 1994, right? So again, overall, what we see, particularly now sort of focusing on the Sikkim Darjeeling Himalaya context, is that indigeneity is increasingly articulated through the post-colonial category of the tribe, which is a result, I would argue, of the broader marginalization of these borderland communities within the Indian nation state. Right, so moving on, however, right, the concept of indigeneity in the Eastern Himalaya, particularly in Darjeeling and Sikkim Himalaya, is highly contentious. And this, I argue, is because the dominant sort of articulation of indigeneity is shaped by colonial discourses of nativism and tribalism, right? So again, what is nativism? Nativism refers to the idea of being original inhabitant of the land, that is, having originary ties to the land, which is seen as a crucial sort of factor in attaining tribal indigenous status. Now, this notion of nativism draws largely from indigenous movements in settler colonial contexts like USA, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. However, in the Eastern Himalayas context, where the borders between countries like India, Nepal, Tibet, in China, Bhutan, etc., are very porous, such nativist discourse often reinforces exclusionary practices, right? Where the colonial concept of native sort of tends to exclude and erase histories of mobility of borderland communities like the Kirat Rais, right? So again, because of this sort of nativistic discourse, there is a tendency for communities like Kirat Rais and other Nepali-speaking communities to often be misclassified as immigrants from Nepal rather than being recognized as indigenous, given their ancestral ties across the border in parts of Eastern Nepal, right? So again, that is one of the sort of colonial discourse that frames indigeneity in the region and therefore is problematic according to my argument. And secondly, the other colonial discourse that defines indigeneity in the region is that of tribalism. All right, so again, tribalism is linked to the notion of primitive inertia, which means, again, viewing tribes or those communities categorized as tribes or scheduled tribes as backward and culturally distinct from caste Hindus. So again, placing them in the lower rungs of a civilizational sort of ladder, right? And this discourse often, of course, influences the Indian reservation system's definition of scheduled tribe, which still uses these colonial, racialized, essentialist sort of ideas in defining who a tribal is and therefore who can be considered to be indigenous, right? Right. And in the context of, again, Sikkim, Darjeeling, Himalaya, as in Nepal, the Kirat Rai community, as other communities, have historically undergone process of Hinduization and assimilation within the sort of Hindu Nepali customs. And because of this cultural sort of assimilation, this complicates the demand for recognition as tribal or indigenous status, which is also often sort of rejected by the state, right? So again, as you can see, these two sort of colonial dominant narratives that frame indigeneity and politics of indigeneity in the region tends to exclude and further marginalize communities like Kirat Rai, who are very much borderland communities, with ancestry or tracing the ancestry across the borders of nation states like India and Nepal. So here, I argue that both nativism and tribalism perpetuate the notion of authenticity, which requires communities to prove their indigeneity by proving the purity of their authentic tribal culture. Right. And as a response to this, the Kirat Rai communities in the Sikkim, Darjeeling, Himalaya, as well as other communities in a similar position like the Limbu community, Gurung, Tamang, etc., right? They have started to push for a cultural distinctiveness by reviving their ancestral practices and distancing themselves from sort of Hindu Nepali customs. But at the same time, they're falling into the trap of this sort of nativist tribalistic discourse, attempting to construct an authentic tribal cultural trait where, they sort of draw on various traditional attires, songs, dances, etc., that often shows signs of cultural exhibitionism and self-exoticization, right? So within such a politics of indigeneity, and the dominant discourse around indigeneity, Sakila Sili dance. So what role does Sakila Sili dance play is that it acts as a cultural marker of authenticity, as tribal, and serves as a tool of representation within this politics of indigeneity, right? Rahul, am I running short of time?
You will have about 2 minutes
Okay,
remaining.
yeah, that is good enough. Okay, so moving on, I just have a couple of slides left. So moving on, however, what I want to argue is that following Indigenous dance scholarship that emphasizes on Indigenous epistemologies, Sakila Sili can be viewed not merely as the sort of symbolic representational tool, but rather also it can be sort of imagined and conceptualized as a dynamic performative praxis that actively sort of participates in world making, or in very simple words, I argue that Sakila Sili, through the sort of lens of Indigenous dance scholarship, Sakila Sili can be seen as a form of world making practice, right? And what is world making practice? So basically, in the concept of world making, world is seen as something that does not have a pre-existing reality. It's not something that already exists, but it is something that is created through imagination and through performative action that generates new meanings, new realities, and new identities. And in this context, I'm arguing that Sakila Sili can be seen as a world-making praxis that creates new forms of meanings and identities around indigeneity in the Eastern Himalaya context, right? So in this sense, in looking at Sakila Sili as a world-making process, what we can see is that, or what we can argue is that, first of all, Sakila Sili can serve as a counter map that transcends national borders between countries like India and Nepal, right? And this is seen in its resurgence and flow across these geopolitical boundaries, challenging rigid nationalistic views and presence of vision of the Himalayan region that emphasize on connections and relationality over division, right? And this itself is reflective of the fluid geography of Eastern Himalaya, where there are no natural sort of borders, right? And this is sort of evoked in or invoked in the Sakila Sili's dance steps, which mimics birds that, sort of transcends the Himalaya across the borders. And secondly, again, looking at Sakila Sili as world making also sort of shifts the focus from viewing the dance not as a tradition, but as an art form, right? And again, here, it is the argument is that viewing it as a tradition locates the dance and the community and the notion of indigeneity in the static past, right? And that is the sort of current understanding of indigeneity in the Eastern Himalaya. Whereas looking at it as a form of art or an active performance art form sort of reflects that change and continuity in the past, present, and future, right? So again, this dynamic nature of Sakila Sili reflects Indigenous performativity's ability to innovate and transform. And the contemporary sort of practitioners of Sakila Sili, like our own ancestors, must be seen as adapting and evolving cultural practices, which challenges the notion of pure indigeneity and showcases the dance's role in transformation, right? So finally then, I'm a bit wary of the time. So finally, what I would like to conclude is that, viewing Sakila Sili not just as a tool of representational politics in the region, but also as a form of sort of world-making practice invites us or allows us to redefine indigeneity away from that narrow sort of framework of nativism and tribalism to a more sort of open and subversive understanding of indigeneity in the region, right? So what it allows us to do, viewing Sakila Sili as world making, what that allows us to do is that it allows us to view indigenous identities as something that is relational, right? And something that is not based on authentic subject position, but rather it's processual and performative. So indigeneity not as an authentic sort of subject position, a pre-modern existence, but rather it is a performative practice, a way of doing, rather than being that is characterized by embodied gestures and actions, right? So overall, I want to conclude by saying that rather than sort of seeking to recover a pre-modern past or a lost identity and trying to prove authenticity as tribal or natives, right? We must recognize that indigeneity in the Eastern Himalayan context is an ongoing process of creation and transformation that is produced and sustained through this community-centric actions, right? And in that sense, I go back to my argument by saying that indigeneity and indigenous identities are a performative sort of praxis, and it needs to be seen through that lens. So I'll end that here. I hope I was on time.
No, thank you so much, Rohini. This was such a fantastic presentation, and I'm really looking forward to your project that seems so promising. So I'll reach out separately to ask you more follow up on that. Thanks so much. Yeah, this was a great set of presentations we've had. Each one of the presentation has bearing very clear footprint in very locale with from which the presenters have spoken. I guess presentation by Manshi was kind of overarching commentary on Himalayas environmental landscape while bearing on very individual local knowledge and the way it functions. And I think this kind of panels definitely kind of makes it very evident for everyone to not use singular framework while ascribing their findings to Himalayas. We have set of questions in the chat box. I will have them read to each one of our speaker in their order. And I have a question for each one of the speakers as well, but we've got limited time. So what we're going to do is to take up questions first from the audience and see how much time we've got left, and then I can ask my question towards the end. So there's lots of thanks for the presentation in general, and people have enjoyed across all presentation. Anup Kumar Dey has a question, and he says, I'm Anup Kumar Dey. I'd like to ask Manshi that how cultural contention become cynosure points of attention in conservation of Eastern Himalayas. And then the second of half of the question is to Rinan, but I think if Manshi, if you'd like to respond to that before moving.
I think, the presentations made by Renan and more by even Rohini, I think have kind of addressed this question of indigeneity and the way it is articulated. I'm not too familiar with the Eastern Himalaya, but I definitely understand that there is it's very, what do you say? It cannot be compared to the Western Himalaya as far as how indigenous politics and, how state making has happened in the Western Himalaya using the tribal status as a constitutional category. Something that even actually Rohini's presentation was very eye-opening for me, because one tends to assume that these contestations around and the politics around indigeneity are existent more in the Western Himalaya, because there is also presence of caste within caste and other, kind of, there is this otherization which is actively happening with the presence of a Brahminical state and the entire Hindu identity which is being invoked. So, I mean, this is completely new for me to answer in the context of the Eastern Himalaya. But I would say that the principles of inclusivity, equity, justice, I think that these become important vis-a-vis, the narrow framework that Rohini was talking about. And if that is how it is being articulated, then it needs to be rethought of. But yeah, in the context of Western Himalayas, certainly this nativism needs to be questioned. We are seeing it actively operating, in places like Jaunsar Bawar or in the Sirmaur region, where the Rajputs are demanding a tribal status, and that demand has also been conceded to in Jaunsar Bawar. This leads to further exclusion of the Dalit communities and further, structural violence. So yeah, I'll just stop over there. The conservation part of it is, I think that then, I mean, I think that it tends to kind of focus only on sustainability in a very narrow sense. I think that it needs to be looked at, like I said, in a wider sense with principles of equity and justice, also.
Yeah, Renan, you've got a couple of questions. I'll try and ask at least two of them so that other speakers will have time to respond. So this Anup has a similar question following up, where he asked in Darjeeling how the water scarcity is getting exacerbated by the feeling of Gorkhaland. If there's any interlinkages between Gorkhaland and the water scarcity. And can I ask you a second question, if you don't mind, Renan, in the order? Okay. And the second question is by Udita Bose, who says, "Hello, Renan. Thank you so much for your presentation. Darjeeling has a huge inflow of tourists over the years. How far do you think tourism impact water supplies, leaving water, as you mentioned, a luxury rather than a resource embedded in everyday life?"
Uh, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, so I mean, by feelings of Gorkhaland, that question is a little. I mean, in terms of what do we mean by feelings of Gorkhaland? Probably that's something we need to think about. But what I looked at was how the statehood agitation movement, in a sense, creates institutional not creates, when a territorial council is created as, as a solution to a statehood demand. It what it is doing, it is also creating segregation or fragmentation in the different institutions. So that is one. And when the fragmentation happens, you clearly have your sources of funding from either the state, which is either the provincial state of West Bengal, or say the territorial council. So in a way, there have been lots of instances about, this, what do we say, this kind of when the state gets irked, there have been instances of how funding gets delayed, how the funding doesn't flow through when it is required. So I am also trying to look at it and see how the flow of funds happen, and do these expressions of, statehood independence have an impact on the investments that are made into the region for water access. So that's how I look at the whole question. And in terms of course, yes, tourists have also, the nature of tourism has also changed. It's not only the numbers, but the nature in terms of, initially when we were younger, it would likely be tourists in, you have the quote unquote tourist season, right, when the tourists come. But now tourism is a year long event, and and the hotels which with larger purchasing powers uh, have do take over, for example, because private tankers are one such sources which, supply to the hotels also, but also supply it to the households. So there are instances of how tankers get kidnapped midway by hotels. So there are very, explicit examples of how water resources being captured, to move, for it to move away. But when I mentioned the luxury part, I feel I meant it more in the municipality access, because only certain strata of the society with certain kind of social and financial capital can access it. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Right. Just to say, some of you who may have missed presentation, do not fret. This has been recorded and will be put out by Doing Sociology. So thanks to them again for doing this work. And partly the reason I'm, reading out the question here. There are two questions, I think, Renan, again to you. and both of them really appreciate your presentation. So the first question is kind of larger role of boreholes in securing water in Darjeeling and the ways in which institution kind of been set up to manage that. And the second question is from Nikesh, which is about is there any illegal network of water distribution in Darjeeling?
Yeah, I think the illegal question is something which I have also to deal with. In a sense, what would you term illegal, right? In a sense, when people are getting water sources from the private, so I think it is very important to understand what do you consider as illegal, because in the functioning of the town itself, there is nothing that is said to be illegal, right? Even in the eyes of the municipality itself. They do mention tankers as water mafia, but but uh, but the illegal aspect, I think it becomes interesting because the tankers also say that, if the municipality knows of our existence, why don't they stop us all? Right. So in a sense, I think we have to look at whether what do we call illegal in the first place, and then think about the other questions that come after it. And in terms of boreholes, that is the biggest misconception that we need to put out there, especially when we talk about water policy, is that the mountains don't have bore wells. All of them are dependent on springs. However, there are high altitude, flatter lands like in Ladakh, or smoother plains in some instances in closer, which have softer hills, which might have bore wells. But this is one of the biggest critiques that we have of the National Sample Survey and other national level surveys, where springs doesn't even find a place, being the majority source. So I think that is a big, no-no. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? I mean, recently we've had the research by Manish Kumar where he's kind of arguing for how it's not accounted for the spring water at all across Himalayas in national water sample. So I think, yeah, that's a very important point. And there's a last two questions, I think, by Chand. I'd read the second question, first question second. I think, and the question is to Dr. Rohini. For me, this somehow serves as a parallel to second and third generation South Asian immigrants in first world countries and how they work towards to revive their culture. I don't know, have you looked at that string?
Yeah. So I'm just reading the question. So the server parallel to second, third generation South Asian immigrants. Yeah, so I mean, outwardly, yes, I think there will be parallels, right? In the context of any mobility, because people do take their cultures to new places that they go. But at the same time, I do think there are differences, right? In the context of South Asian migrants in global North countries like the UK, US, etc. I don't think it is, first of all, a revival. I think it is a continuity as well in the process of migration. And secondly, there's a lot of literature around, South Asian cultural forms, in the context of diaspora, and particularly, as you mentioned, second and third generation sort of diaspora, there's a lot of work again around hybridity. So how they sort of hybridize their, South Asian cultural practices with the practices of, the country that they've grown up in and so on. So there is a lot of literature there. But I do want to mention that I think this is an important question because number one, in the context of Kirat-Rai and other Nepali-speaking communities seeking tribal status, there is a sense of revival, right, or that resurgence, and there's a sense of the sort of loss, something that was practiced many years in the past, but, it was left whatever, and then now so that sense of revivalism is there, although those practices have been sort of continuing on the side for generations. So that's there. And secondly, I think, I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, but secondly, I think this question is important because it opens up more questions around conceptualizing indigeneity in diaspora, right? And this links to my work with the Nepali indigenous communities from Nepal in the UK, right? So they are South Asian diaspora. There are first, second, even third generation. And even within that, Sakala Sili dance sort of has really emerged as a very key sort of, cultural signifier as both indigenous and as migrants, right? So again, I think it goes back to the whole discourse around nativism, where indigeneity or an indigenous identity is not the opposite of being a migrant. You can be indigenous and you can be migrant at the same time. And that's why I think we need to move beyond the whole nativism and tribalism discourse. Yeah, I hope that kind of made sense.
We've got two more questions. So I'd only ask Dichin questions, and Rashmi's question will have to wait because I have got one question from each of the speaker. I'm very sorry, Rashmi. So Dichin's question is, and this is across all presenter, Dichin says, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. Her question, Dichin's question is that how does one's identity as native or non-native shape issues entry into the field? In other words, how does navigating the field influence our subjectivities during field work? Anyone is welcome to answer that question.
I can carry on, and then because I was on a tangent. Anyway, how does one's identity as native or non-native shape issue of entry into the field? So again, I personally move away from the idea of native versus non-native or insider versus outsider subjectivity or positionality. And again, that is primarily because I think the categories of native and non-native sort of essentializes identity, right? I think everyone is an outsider as a researcher to a certain extent because we all come from a place of privilege. Ethnically, we might be, similar, or we might share ethnic identity, but based on class or other positions, a researcher is most likely, in a position of privilege compared to the researched. And therefore, how do you navigate this? I think, let me go back to the question. So yeah, so first of all, again, I don't necessarily agree with the native versus non-native binary, but again, coming back, I think it does influence entry or access into the field, in a way that how the sort of participants in the field, perceive the researcher. I think that does in many ways impact how much of access you get into the field, which has certainly been in my case, at least. Yeah, so yeah, I think I'll just stop at that.
Great, thanks. There is one more question, but Rashmi will have to wait. I have one question from each one of the speakers. Please choose not to answer. I know we're stretching the presentation anyway. My first question is to Manshi, which is more generally about, this kind of emergent vocabulary around, explosive vocabulary around the idea of transition, So you have green transition, just transition, one after another, explosion of vocabulary that now very reasonably try to justify kind of cost benefit, especially with relation to your long-standing work on hydropower projects. I was wondering if you could speak a few words on what do you think of these emergent vocabularies around transition discourse.
Yeah, I think that the one is the vocabulary and the other is direct, policy implications that it is having. And now like you said, there's a verdict which has, uh, it's become climate change versus biodiversity conservation, which is very contradictory, because now suddenly it's, complicated the issue further. And I think for people who don't even have access to what is going on in this entire, global narrative on climate strategies, it's extremely difficult to, kind of come to terms with these debates and discourses. And I think that it definitely requires questioning. And this whole top-down kind of a focus of transition, looking at the whole carbon fetishism that is there in this conceptualization. It's problematic, and I think that more and more there's a need to critique it from different disciplines and different approaches. So I would say that. And can I just also respond to the question of the field?
Absolutely. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's a again, like, I think I would agree with like, all of us are outsiders, or the privileges that one goes with. And even as an activist, generally, we enter into a situation when there's an environmental conflict. And it has mostly been when we are approached by communities. I'm using the word community in quotes. And there is an expectation that there has to be something that has to be a give and take in that relationship. So it can't be like where we are kind of building an understanding of what is going on in a particular place without giving back what is required or expected, which could be anything from support with legal advocacy, drafting letters, whatever work that we do. But in that, like, bringing back to the coming back to this idea of community, that many a times we are expected to react in a situation that that may represent the interests of a particular community, or may go against the interests of another, and may involve gatekeepers within on the community. And that is where I think that that is where personal relationships, long-term kind of an approach, where we are going very slow with the so-called field work. Again, field is something that I use with a lot of caution. I think in our interactions and engagements and connections, it takes a long time to build relationships, and those relationships are extremely important, if especially when we are living or when we are also inhabiting the place. So it cannot be, it requires a lot of negotiation and bargaining and dialogue, and also challenging that happens on both sides. So being open to being challenged, and also challenging when the time comes, for to raise certain pertinent questions around ethics of various and moralities of various kinds. So I think that it's not black and white. It's an ongoing process, I would say.
Thanks. Thanks, Manshi, for further deepening that response through your question. I have a question. I know we are way too ahead of our time. Yeah. So my question is to Rinan. I really like the idea. I think towards the end you said there's kind of a bifurcation between biophysical kind of landscape question and the political question, right? And I was wondering, in that respect of this kind of, contestation between biophysical and political division, in which the access to spring and ways in which law can and cannot govern it. So what are the different ways in which this question kind of even like kind of appears when the question of law and implementation comes?
Yeah, and there have been instances where it is said that, why doesn't state take over the springs? But what should be kept in mind, like the borehole question, is that springs are groundwater, so groundwater are associated with the rent law, which means anything under the ground can be a property of the landowner, right? So in a way, if a spring emerges out of your land, it becomes your spring. So in a way, you have you have, as I mentioned, there is patronage. It used to be. I mean, there are very big springs in Darjeeling and some in Sikkim, where you have springs which are named over after certain families, because the land was owned by them, but it is given away so that it can be used for the larger public good. But what is happening in some ways are I feel the public springs will stay because they are visible. A lot of people are dependent on it. 200, 300 households are dependent on it, and they are visible. So the public nature of the spring itself, even because it has been transferred to for the use of public good, it becomes important. But there are, because in Darjeeling you have visibly, you probably have, I encountered around 50 to 80 springs during my work. So in a sense, the smaller springs have more chances of being taken over because they are small, only like a household or two depend on it, and they might be taken over either for privatization, for profit, or for themselves. And in many cases, springs have also disappeared overnight. So it's, in a sense, we have different implications from the biophysical aspect, but also the urbanization aspect, as well as the legality of springs themselves. Thank you.
Thanks. And just the last question to Rohini. I was thinking, I mean, it's such an interesting presentation. I was thinking, to what extent do you think more broadly within the academic literature, there is this tendency to kind of depoliticize cultural tools of assertion? Because the idea is these, cultural facets of, and because you're saying that indigeneity is constituted sometimes by performance, in what way do you think that there would be an attempt for depoliticizing this?
You mean in academic writings?
Yeah, in more broadly within the writing, yeah.
And how the sort of academic writing tends to depoliticize this, right?
Yeah, yeah. And you have like, Alpasha's work on, sacral polity, where she's talking about these performance by Munda group in Jharkhand, and
Okay.
often looked at cultural practices as sites of like depoliticize. So do you think in your field site or your study, you've also found that making this argument becomes takes a lot to make this argument?
Okay, that's a good question. And to be honest, I haven't really thought about it, but it's a good, I think, a point to take forward. In terms of, I think, in academic literature, from what I've seen, right, a sort of anthropological literature, from what I've seen, a lot of them, especially the older ones, tend to depoliticize the dance. I mean, from what I've seen, there are hardly any. Okay, let me talk about Sakela Sili because I want to go further because I can't speak for other forms of dances. But for Sakela Sili particularly, if you just go to Google Scholar, if you just search, majority of the academic literature is, again, I feel like that too sort of goes back to that tribalistic, nativistic discourse. So, for example, it's a lot of descriptive anthropological work on what Sakela Sili is, what each dance step means. It is performed, again, going to some remote villages in like, Eastern Nepal and learning about the dance, and right. It's a very descriptive account, whereas I do think, and, I would argue that Sakela Sili dance, it is political, albeit it is not as recognized within academic discourse. Similarly, it is a very crucial tool, I would say, in the contemporary politics of indigeneity. But at the same time, it is not explicitly used as a political tool, if that makes sense. I think it is much more implicit, sort of cultural, low-key kind of a tool of sort of representation within that politics of indigeneity. If that I answered your question, yeah.
No, thank you so much. Again, we're very sorry, Rashmi, we cannot take your question. And I'll hand over, just saying that this was great, and the recording will be out soon. And it's a great privilege to actually be able to host such great presentations. So thank you, each one of you, for your brilliant presentation today. Dipali, you want to say?
Yes, thank you, Rahul, and thank you to all the three speakers. I mean, it was just brilliant listening to all three of you. Very interesting presentations. And from the Doing Sociology team, we're very grateful to Rahul, who very kindly has been very supportive of us from the very beginning. So thank you for moderating, this session and bringing together the speakers. And to all the three speakers today, we hope to have you again on Doing Sociology sometime soon. And to the audience members, yes, the recording will be available online. Thank you once again, and wish you all a good evening ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.